The book aims to provide philosophical guidance and perspectives on navigating the challenges of midlife, a period often characterized by crises, doubts, and reflections on one's life and choices. Setiya explores common midlife issues like feelings of stagnation in one's career or relationship, children leaving home, aging parents requiring care, worries about mortality, and a sense that one's best years may be behind them. He draws on philosophical theories and figures like Aristotle, Kieran, Nietzsche to shed light on midlife questions about identity, purpose, priorities, relationships, and finding renewed meaning and engagement in one's life as it progresses. Concepts discussed include Aristotle's notion of finding one's function or true self, Nietzsche's idea of self-overcoming through continual growth and transformation, and Kierkegaard's view of repeated choice-making as central to living an authentic existence. Setiya examines how philosophical reflection and perspectives can help those in midlife review their lives critically but constructively, reconsider life goals, adapt to changes, and face impending losses or limitations with perseverance, grace, and acceptance. The book aims to demonstrate how philosophy remains relevant to life's challenges at any age by providing conceptual tools and alternatives for thinking about perennial existential questions. The book takes an approach to hardship that does not involve denial, repression, or justifying suffering. It acknowledges difficulties rather than avoiding them. The goal is not necessarily happiness, but living well, which involves facing reality as it is rather than how we wish it to be. Happiness is subjective, while living well has moral dimensions. Succeeding or achieving the best in life often brings dismay, and we should not see suffering as always leading to good outcomes or having deeper reasons. Philosophies that claim suffering is deserved or will be rewarded neglect the reality and ethical problems of human pain and injustice. Reflecting honestly on hardship leads to concern for others, not just self-interest. Justice and compassion are entangled with individual suffering. The book will examine various hardships: physical disability, pain, loneliness, grief, failure, injustice. It aims to help lift the weight of human suffering through understanding, not quick fixes. The first chapter addresses impacts of physical disability and aging, challenging ideals of perfect ability. Later chapters discuss loneliness, love, loss, and how reflecting on these issues connects to broader social and ethical concerns. The author describes facing chronic pain of unknown origin, starting at age 27. Despite many tests and consultations with doctors, no diagnosis or effective treatment was found. They were eventually told to just ignore the pain if possible. Over the next 13 years, the author learned to live with the daily, nightly discomfort and pain flares as a constant background issue. They stopped taking a low-dose pain medication after a few years with no noticeable effects. During this time, other family members also faced health issues. The author's mother-in-law was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and wrote frankly about her experience. His wife found she had a dermoid cyst on her ovary and is at high risk for certain cancers. His father-in-law had heart surgery. His mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. The author notes they are not uniquely afflicted, but that all families face illnesses, disabilities, and incapacity at some point. Their experience speaks to the vulnerability of the human body and condition. Recent work in philosophy of medicine has emphasized distinguishing disease, biological malfunction, from illness, negative impact on lived experience. Disease is biological, but illness depends on social factors like access to health care. Disability theorists argue disability should be understood as a social, political issue rather than purely medical. Having a disability does not inherently make one's life worse. Much depends on social accommodations and prejudice. Physical disability involves biological malfunction, but need not cause illness if circumstances are accommodating. The effects of disability on well-being depend on contingencies like luck and social support systems. Extensive research shows people with disabilities do not generally report lower life satisfaction. Aristotle's view that the good life lacks nothing is problematic and has been liberalized. There are many plural good lives depending on one's interests, talents, and circumstances, rather than a single ideal. Disabilities may preclude some valued activities, but accommodating societies can enable disabled people to live fulfilling lives. The passage discusses views on living a good life with disabilities from philosophers like Karl Marx, as well as real examples like baseball owner Bill Veeck and disability rights activist Harriet McBride Johnson. It argues disabilities do not necessarily prevent living well as long as some valuable activities are still possible. While becoming disabled can be traumatic, people often adapt better than expected. However, some disabilities may impose too many limitations or involve severe pain, making life profoundly difficult. Policy should maximize opportunities for disabled people. The passage then shares the author's personal experience with chronic pelvic pain over many years, seeing multiple doctors and struggling to find effective treatment, illustrating the embodied challenges of disability and pain. Overall, it presents a nuanced view that while disability does not inherently preclude a good life, accommodations and access to opportunities are important, and some conditions may be extremely hard to adapt to due to loss of activities or severe pain. Personal experiences also vary greatly. The author has experienced chronic pain for years that causes flare-ups and insomnia. They have undergone numerous medical procedures that provided no useful information but caused intense pain. The author questions why pain is considered bad if it is not completely debilitating. They are still able to function, though sleep deprivation is difficult. The author argues against views that pain cannot be expressed through language or defined. They say pain has referential content by representing damaged or stressed parts of the body. A vocabulary exists to describe different pain sensations. While pain represents bodily distress, this representation can sometimes be misleading or illusory. An example is pain experienced in an amputated limb. The author's pain may not reflect actual damage. The author says pain disrupts one's ordinary experiences and engagement with life by drawing attention to the body. It impedes access to positive experiences. Philosophers like Descartes acknowledged pain shows the connection between mind and body. The anticipated pleasure of being pain-free can also be misleading once pain subsides. Understanding pain helps one feel less alone and gain perspective on what it means to have a body. While painful, this knowledge provides a kind of solace or comfort. The author believes their experience with pain fosters compassion for others who may also be suffering, as concern for one's own pain connects to concern for others. The passage discusses chronic pain versus acute minor pain experienced by many individuals. It argues that chronic pain is qualitatively different due to how it affects expectations and memory of a life without pain. Chronic pain confines one to the present moment and makes imagining a pain-free future difficult. It distorts memory of a past without pain. This temporal dimension makes chronic pain worse than a mere succession of distinct pains. However, the passage notes that even distinct pains experienced at different times by the same person are still not shareable across time. No one can experience pain on behalf of their past or future self. Still, by writing or talking about pain, we can overcome some of the separateness between self and others. Compassion for one's own past, future suffering can cultivate compassion for what others experience. Suffering can foster solidarity. The passage advocates focusing on the present moment rather than the future when dealing with chronic or acute pain. It also acknowledges the loneliness that often accompanies chronic illness or disability. More work remains to address loneliness as a wider social problem. The passage discusses the distinction between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness involves emotional pain from social disconnection, while solitude is simply being alone without feelings of loneliness. It notes the rise in concern about loneliness in recent decades, with some data showing increased reports of people having no one to talk to about important matters. However, other research has challenged these findings and argued social connections have remained stable. The history of loneliness is more complex than the narrative of increasing individualism leading to more loneliness. Loneliness predates the 1800s and terms for it. Additionally, the market economy may have actually created space for more intimate friendships. Pandemics greatly increased loneliness due to lockdowns and isolation, but loneliness was already a serious public health issue linked to increased inflammation, immune system response, and higher mortality rates. The experience of loneliness causes real psychological and physical pain, but The reasons for this pain and why it tells us about human social needs are not fully understood. Philosophy has generally not directly addressed loneliness, but hints at it through struggles with the idea of radical solipsism and proving the existence of anything outside the solitary self. Several philosophers like Hegel, Sartre, and Wittgenstein argued that we cannot fully achieve self-awareness or have a subjective self without relationships to other people. Our subjectivity is not self-sustaining and depends on social relations. However, just because something necessary for something good, like social relations, are necessary for self-awareness, it does not mean that necessary thing shares the same value. The canvas of a beautiful painting is necessary, but not beautiful itself. Loneliness is bad for humans, not just because it subverts self-awareness, but because we are inherently social animals. We evolved to live in social groups and feel vulnerability from lack of social connections. Experiments show infants and animals deprived of social contact suffer lasting harm. Solitary confinement in prisons also causes severe psychological impacts. These show our deep need for human contact. However, we also need solitude. Kant spoke of our unsociable sociability, needing others but also space from them. Most people fall in the middle of the social solitary spectrum. To understand why loneliness is bad, we need to understand why friendship is good. Aristotle's work on friendship is examined as offering key insights that we have varying types of friendships and see family as a type of friendship. Aristotle viewed true friendship as based on mutual appreciation of virtue between noble and virtuous men. He thought friendship requires notable virtue and is conditional on one's character. However, the author argues friendship is more about recognizing human dignity rather than virtue alone. We can be friends without being heroes. Friends matter ultimately because of who they are as individuals, not just their qualities. When visiting a sick friend, it's better to go out of concern for them rather than just maintaining the friendship. Loneliness hurts because it means lacking affirmation of one's worth from others through love. We need the unconditional value that love provides. Being friendless leaves one feeling invisible and their humanity unappreciated. While loneliness is difficult to cure, escaping it predicted by recognizing each person's inherent dignity, as confirmed by stories where reaching out to understand others helps overcome isolation and despair. True friendship is about cherishing individuals, not just the connection between them. The passage discusses confronting loneliness and how it can be a self-reinforcing cycle of rejection, distrust, and self-criticism. Lonely people tend to be highly alert for social threats and less reliable at interpreting social cues. It's difficult to escape loneliness without help from others, but reaching out to others induces anxiety, creating a catch-22 situation. Changing loneliness takes sustained effort to reduce social anxiety. Loneliness is a societal problem, not just an individual one, and deserves more funding for mental health programs. One example program cut loneliness rates in half by having weekly group lessons focused on relationships. The way to overcome loneliness paradoxically involves focusing on others' needs rather than one's own loneliness. Small interactions like friendly greetings can help forge connections over time through compassion and affirming others' value. Activities like volunteering, classes, sports, podcast interviews where one listens intently can help mitigate loneliness by shifting focus to others. While new friends can't replace loss, addressing grief requires acknowledging a range of complex emotions beyond just sorrow. Grief is complex and takes different forms. Relational grief from a fractured relationship, grief over harm to someone who died, and grief over the sheer loss of life. These can interact in different ways. Grief manifests in different feelings at different times and is fluid, making it hard to generalize from one's own experience. Didion's account of grief describes the profound shock and sense of meaninglessness, but that may not reflect others' experiences. Psychological research shows grief does not follow predictable stages and is better understood as waves that come and go. Forced debriefing after trauma has negative long-term effects. Some of the most moving accounts of grief are nonlinear and fragmentary, like Barth's diary entries or Annie Ernaux's account of her mother's Alzheimer's. B.S. Johnson's novel The Unfortunates presents grief as having no narrative order. Ancient schools like Stoicism viewed grief as a problem to be solved by detaching from things outside one's control. But insisting we should not care about uncontrollable losses is akin to sour grapes and distances us from what really matters, like love. While dulling pain, it risks conditioning us to oppressive situations. True Stoicism rested on a divine order that gave losses meaning, not just a platitude about desire. Grief is a natural and multifaceted response to various types of loss, including loss of relationships and loss of people we may not have known personally. Romantic grief is illustrated through the author's experience grieving a breakup at age 15. Grief involves not just oneself, but also mourning the changes in the relationship. Distinctions are made between completed relationships where the other person is still alive versus archived relationships where the person has died. Even archived relationships continue to exert influence in some way. Maintaining a connection to the deceased risks pulling one away from living engagement, but letting go feels disloyal. The challenge is accepting changes in the relationship without feeling it is over. Individual relationships are unique, but generally grief involves adjusting to new terms of connection rather than abandoning the relationship. Memories can bring both pain and comfort over time. Grief has two sides: grief over the fractured relationship and grief for the deceased person's sake. Dealing with changes to the relationship does not resolve the pure mourning aspect of losing the person. Ancient philosophers like Epicurus argued that death is not harmful because when you die, you cease to exist and do not experience anything like pain. However, this view is seen as sophistry because death deprives us of future life experiences, relationships, and projects that we would have enjoyed. While early death deprives someone of a normal lifespan worth grieving for, very late-stage death after a long, fulfilling life is less of a misfortune and not something to excessively grieve over. Grief has multiple components: grief over lost relationships, grief for the deceased's lost future, and grief over the sheer fact of their non-existence. All are valid expressions of love for the deceased. Grief is a natural emotional process that subsides over time for most people, though questions remain about whether this means we valued the deceased less. While reasons for grief don't change, grieving involves an emotional process that changes how we feel. Grief is perplexing because its reasons, the fact of someone's death, are permanent, yet grief doesn't last forever. But grief, like love, involves an ongoing emotional process rather than a static emotional state dictated purely by reasons. The author discusses the importance of rituals and social practices in mourning the loss of loved ones through death. Rituals help structure and give meaning to the experience of grief, which is chaotic and irrational on its own. Rituals of mourning have changed over time, becoming more private. Death used to be more communal and ritualized at home, but now often occurs isolated in hospitals. This leaves many feeling uncertain how to mourn. The author reflected on attending the funeral of a beloved colleague, noting the community support that surrounded the grieving family. Different cultures have their own mourning rituals. Rituals are especially important now during the pandemic, as social distancing disrupts traditional ways of mourning collectively. The author experienced this after his father-in-law's sudden death, with a virtual memorial service and isolated grieving. In the absence of familiar rituals, people must improvise new ways to mourn and honor the deceased, through personal acts that echo aspects of their life and relationship. Rituals structure and give meaning to the experience of profound grief and loss. The passage discusses the idea of tradition or ritual as potential antidotes to grief. While rituals can provide structure, grief is a complex and ongoing process with no single resolution. The key questions around mourning concern how to balance remembering versus forgetting a lost loved one, and whether success means staying static in grief or moving forward. Ultimately, grief reminds us that life has no happy endings wrapped in a neat narrative package. It may not be a story at all. Rituals and conventions can offer structure to grief, but grief itself is not a linear process with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It leads into uncharted territory. The desire for narrative closure conflicts with grieving well. Grief has perpetual ambivalence and no permanent solution. The scar may reopen. While rituals lend structure, grieving well means accepting its ongoing and unresolved nature. Here are the key points summarized. Paul Ricoeur, Charles Taylor, and Daniel Dennett view life as a narrative. We understand ourselves through telling the story of our lives as unfolding narratives. Galen Strawson challenges this view, saying he has no sense of his own life as a narrative. His example serves as a counter to the narrative theory of life. While stories can take many nonlinear forms, proponents of life as narrative tend to view it as a single, integrated dramatic arc with a climax. Examples like Iris Murdoch and Bill Veeck show lives can be meaningful without conforming to a clear narrative structure. Their lives contained inconsistencies, failures, changes of direction. Defining life too narrowly as a narrative risks seeing it as a failure if the narrative doesn't go as planned or reach a climax. But lives contain countless small successes and failures, not a single overriding judgment. Telling life stories can be useful for self-understanding, but we shouldn't restrict the possibilities to a single dramatic arc or feel life is a failure if it lacks a tight narrative structure. Lives are richer and more varied than any single story can capture. The author argues that it is important to distinguish between two types of activities: telic activities, which aim at completion or success failure, and atelic activities, which have no defined end state. Telic activities like projects expose us to the risk of failure and lead us to only value life in the past or future, rather than living fully in the present. The author analyzes Prince Mishkin from Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot as an example of someone who focuses on atelic activities like being kind and truthful to others in each situation, rather than having ambitious goals or projects. Though many things do not turn out as Mishkin intends, he is not defined by successes and failures, but rather living well in each moment. Drawing on Aristotle and Eastern philosophy like the Bhagavad Gita, the author argues we should care about both the process and outcomes of our actions, but we tend to value telic activities too much and miss the importance of engaging fully with atelic activities in each present moment. This exposes us less to failure and allows us to truly value life as it is unfolding. Telic activities have a clear end or goal, so they can be exhausted or completed, leaving nothing more to be done. Atelic activities do not have a clear end, so they cannot be exhausted, and one can be doing them and have done them simultaneously, e.g., thinking, understanding. Aristotle argued that living well is an alic activity. One is living well as they are doing it, unlike learning or healing, which have a clear beginning and end. We should value atelic activities and processes to ensure ourselves against failure. Not all of life involves projects with clear ends, and even where projects are important, the process also matters. Examples are given of Gerard Winstanley's protest for equality in the 1600s, which failed politically but has enduring value, and the film Groundhog Day, which can be seen as portraying an atelic orientation or as a Buddhist allegory about repetition. The modern notion of individuals being failures emerged in the 19th century as credit reports and success failure in business came to define identity. Success was attributed to individual character rather than circumstances. This cultural lens made it difficult to value atelic activities and see beyond success failure of projects. So in summary, the passage discusses Aristotle's distinction between telic and atelic activities, argues we should value atelic processes to insulate ourselves from failure, and analyzes how modern culture reinforced defining people by their project successes or failures. The passage advocates for the theory of self-made men, the idea that success is determined mainly by one's own hard work and exertion, rather than opportunity alone. It proclaims that those who succeed simply worked harder, better, and more wisely than others. It suggests allowing people fair opportunity and then letting them succeed or fail on their own merits through their own hard work and talents. It concludes that the key to success is work, not opportunities or advantages. However, the passage notes that understanding one's life solely through this lens of individual success or failure promotes identifying as a loser or winner and can lead to spiritual collapse when one fails economically. It draws parallels to present-day deaths of despair among non-college educated white Americans who internalize the belief that hard work guarantees success while ignoring broader systemic obstacles. The passage questions how sustainable this individualistic view of success is in a capitalist system that concentrates wealth and opportunity and leaves many struggling or perceiving themselves as failures through no real fault of their own. So in summary, it examines both the rhetoric of self-made success through hard work alone, as well as the psychological and social pressures that come with viewing one's worth solely through an economic lens of individual success or failure. Here are the key points summarized. Glaucon argues that without laws or consequences, humans would simply act in self-interest by taking whatever they want with impunity. We only care about justice out of fear of punishment. The philosopher counters that this view rests on questionable assumptions. Different people may act in self-interest in different ways if freed from constraints. Self-interest is not necessarily at odds with morality. If the goal is human flourishing rather than just happiness, living well requires concern for the rights and needs of others. The philosopher examines the life of Simone Weil as an example of someone who took injustice extremely seriously through self-sacrifice. While inspiring, her model is also terrifying to consider replicating. Philosophers have tried to argue rationally that we should care about justice, but such proofs don't work on those determined not to accept the premise. We can know justice matters without convincing everyone. The alternative is not more proofs, but paying attention to whether something in justice itself cries out to be upheld, as Weil puts it. Reasoning may not change minds, but lived examples like Weil's can speak to us despite ourselves. In summary, the passage explores the relationship between self-interest, justice, and morality, ultimately concluding that while justice cannot be proven rationally, examples of living morally may still resonate with and guide us on an intuitive level. The passage discusses the concept of attention or close reading as described by Simone Weil. For Weil, reading is how we interpret and make sense of the world around us at every moment. It uses the story of Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville as an example of how open to interpretation a text can be. There are many possible readings of Bartleby's character and meaning. The passage analyzes the lawyer character in the story who struggles to understand and interpret Bartleby. Though flawed, he makes earnest efforts through his language to grasp Bartleby's humanity. It draws parallels to Iris Murdoch's example of altering one's perceptions to see reality more clearly. This relates to Weil's concept of attention as a form of moral discipline. Maintaining this focused attention on others, rather than turning away, is important for compassion. Both Weil and Murdoch saw a connection between attention, respect for others, and unconditional love. The passage then turns to examining theories of justice in political philosophy from Plato to Rawls. It questions the assumption that philosophy should start from describing a perfectly just ideal society. So in summary, it explores the connections between close reading, interpretation, compassion, and theories of justice through analyzing Weil Melville's story and different philosophers' approaches. The author argues that ideal theory or utopian thinking that aims to conceive the perfectly just society is misguided. We don't need a blueprint for utopia to identify injustice. We can look at real-world examples like America's history of oppression. Critical theory teaches that our conception of what is possible is distorted by ideology. It's difficult to imagine alternatives to the status quo. Political philosophy should help illuminate injustice in the real world and point to ways to remedy it, rather than theorizing a perfect justice. Theorists like Iris Young develop the concept of structural injustice that emerges from social systems, not just individual acts. We bear responsibility for structural injustice if we contribute to or benefit from unjust systems and outcomes. The obligation is not about blame, but taking political action to reform unjust structures. However, acting alone is futile. We must join collective agents of change like social movements. Issues like climate change raise questions of global injustice, as developing nations face greater impacts despite contributing less to the problem historically. We are responsible not just for our direct emissions, but for climate impacts on others. In summary, the author argues against utopian thinking and for a focus on illuminating and remedying real-world injustices through collective political action, informed by concepts like structural injustice and responsibility. The passage discusses the need for an agent of change to address issues of injustice like climate change. The author describes getting involved in climate activism at MIT after witnessing student protests calling for divestment from fossil fuels. He supported the student sit-in, though divestment was not achieved. The author feels guilty for not doing more, seeing teachers' role as raising awareness and building community to empower students to take further action. The passage then discusses philosopher Theodor Adorno, who was pessimistic about political engagement after the failed German Revolution. Adorno retreated to academia and critiqued society, but withdrew from real activism. Adorno's hesitance to directly engage with student protesters in 1968 exemplifies concerns that philosophy divides thinkers from true agents of change, addressing serious injustice. The passage examines the tension between theory and practice in addressing social issues. The passage discusses the author's early interest in philosophy, stemming from a sense of wonder and worry about existence as a child, staring at tree trunks and being disturbed by their contingency. It introduces existentialist philosophies like Sartre's concept of nausea at confronting the sheer facticity and gratuitousness of reality. The passage then discusses the philosophical question of absurdity, not about explanation, but about meaning. It considers the apparent insignificance and absurdity of human life from a vast cosmic perspective over space and time. Exploring absurdity can lead us back to acknowledgement of love, loss, narrative, the non-ideal, and injustice in the world. Finding meaning in life would mean saying it is not absurd. The author acknowledges the cliché of philosophers pondering life's meaning, but notes academics often dismiss the question as nonsense. The passage sets up further discussion of absurdity and how we can uncover meaning in life despite it. The article discusses the question of whether life has any inherent meaning or purpose. It explores the origins of this question and different philosophical perspectives on it. Philosopher Susan Wolf argues that rather than focusing on the meaning of life as a whole, it's more useful to ask how individuals can lead meaningful lives through their actions and relationships. Nihilism poses the threat that ultimately nothing matters. Existential crises like Tolstoy experienced can raise questions about life's meaninglessness. Simply knowing a purpose or function humans serve wouldn't necessarily provide meaning, like if we learned we were being bred for food. The specific phrase, the meaning of life, originated in 1834 from a fictional character exploring despair over isolation from the world. We tend to ask about life's meaning when suffering, to seek some truth that can reconcile us to loss, failure, injustice, and suffering. Before the 19th century, most derived answers from religious worldviews. But the question arose as religion became less a given backdrop. The question of meaning implies seeking some truth about our place in the universe that can guide our attitude and feelings toward existence. The author argues that religion provides a total reaction upon life by offering a metaphysical view of the world that guides how we feel about life, the universe, and existence. This metaphysical view could involve God, gods, or not, as in Buddhism. A core element of religion is faith in something that transcends the ordinary world, whether that be God, gods, or some metaphysical concept like emptiness, no self in Buddhism. The author discusses how religion historically offered theodicy, explanations for why evil suffering exists that show it works out for the best, often involving an afterlife. Modern philosophers detached this aim from traditional religion. If the meaning of life can exist without God, religion, what truths could help us cope with suffering and injustice? The author is skeptical what these truths could be. In discussing how we should feel about existence, the author notes different temperaments react differently to reality. Pragmatically, taking a positive view is better for living, though neither view truly corresponds to facts. The author ultimately argues that considering a grim scenario like humanity becoming infertile, facing extinction, could provide an answer to life's meaning. It would likely cause widespread despair, loss of meaning, and societal breakdown, since we exist for future generations in an implicit collective afterlife. The passage discusses existential questions around meaning and purpose in the face of human extinction, as depicted in the film Children of Men. It argues against nihilism, saying activities like art, music, and friendship can still have value even if humanity ends. Their worth does not depend entirely on posterity. It cites philosophical arguments that if the value of our actions relies on future generations, then nothing has value for the final generation before extinction. But we don't believe that generation is meaningless. While extinction is dismaying, our emotional response should not be arbitrary. There are rational ways to respond, like resisting nihilism and finding solace in present experiences. Meaning could lie in achieving justice and fulfilling humanity's potential by advancing science, philosophy, creativity, and care for nature before the end. Ending human history prematurely without progress on these fronts would be unacceptable, while meeting our end with grace after doing our best could be acceptable. Achieving justice is important not just for its own sake, but as an antidote to absurdity. It gives meaning to life by dictating a positive way to feel about existence. Progress toward justice in this world, through collective efforts over generations, can provide meaning without needing religious or transcendent concepts. The passage discusses the concept of hope and its ambiguous nature. It references the Greek myth of Pandora's box, where hope was portrayed both as a curse and something left trapped inside. Philosophers view hope as having elements of both desire and belief, wishing for something possible but not certain. It involves emotional attachment to a possibility outside of one's full control. Hope can be seen as both empowering and problematic. It can motivate action but also risk disappointment. While despair is clearly bad, hope's value is more complex. While it may not always be rational to hope where something is truly impossible, hope is also a precondition for striving towards uncertain goals and progress. So hope plays an important role in human endeavor and meaning, even if its outcomes are not guaranteed. Overall, the passage examines the multifaceted nature of hope, how it can be both necessary and problematic, helpful yet risky. It acknowledges the ambiguities in defining and evaluating the role of hope in human life. Hope itself does not inspire action or bring about change. It is a prerequisite for action, but not the driving force. Grief, rage, fear can be stronger motivators. Hope can encourage passivity and inaction if it is not paired with real efforts to enact change. It needs to be rooted in collective action to have impact. There can be an unhealthy form of excessive or unrealistic hope, but there is also a virtue of hoping well, being realistic about probabilities, but keeping possibilities open through courage and will. Hope is not about feeling good, but keeping alive a sense of potential agency even in hard times. It's about acknowledging what's possible with our situations, like finding meaning with disability or failure. Death ultimately limits hope, as there is no natural way to survive it. But hope for humanity and a just future is still possible through collective action on issues like climate change. Radical hope is directed at a future goodness we can't yet understand. Having an open mindset to new concepts that challenge old limits and definitions. Key is not whether to hope, but what to hope for. Hope should motivate action for justice and social change, not just personal fulfillment or happiness. The passage describes the plot of the ancient Greek play Philoctetes by Sophocles. In it, Odysseus and Neoptolemus travel to the deserted island of Lemnos to retrieve Philoctetes and his magical bow, which prophecies say the Greeks need to win the Trojan War. When they find Philoctetes, he has been abandoned for years with a snake-bitten, infected foot. Neoptolemus initially agrees to trick Philoctetes, but changes his mind when touched by Philoctetes' suffering. The play examines themes of illness, isolation, failure, injustice, and how suffering can lead people astray, yet also foster resilience and hope. It's about moral failings, but also the possibility of redemption. Near the end, the chorus quotes a line suggesting justice may rise up one day, rhyming with history and hope. While the poet recognizes this often does not occur, there is potential for it in some unforeseen harmony. The acknowledgments thank various individuals who provided feedback and supported the writing process, without reproducing any copyrighted material. I have attempted to carefully summarize the key details while avoiding direct reproduction of copyrighted content as you instructed. Please let me know if you would like me to clarify or expand on any part of the summary. Here is a brief summary of the key ideas in the passage without directly copying or reproducing copyrighted content. The passage discusses the concept of disability and illness from a philosophical perspective. It considers different views on how to understand and define conditions of impaired health or bodily function. Some key theorists and their approaches are referenced, such as distinguishing between impairment, illness, and the social constructions surrounding disability. The experience of living with chronic pain or illness is explored through brief discussions of philosophers and literary works. Concepts of bodily autonomy, adaptation, and what defines a good life are analyzed in relation to disability. Issues of causation and harm are also touched on through thought experiments. Overall, the passage engages in a philosophical analysis of the metaphysics and phenomenology of disability and illness. Here is a summary of the key points about loneliness from the provided text. Loneliness refers to chronic feelings of lack of connection, not just being alone physically. An estimated 2.5 billion people experience loneliness. Loneliness has become more prevalent due to factors like increased individualism, decline in community, and technology replacing in-person socializing. However, loneliness has long been a human concern, discussed in philosophy and literature. Significant loneliness is associated with higher risks of health problems like cardiovascular disease and anxiety depression. It activates the body's stress response similarly to physical pain. Humans evolved as highly social beings, and social connections and attachments are crucial for development from a young age. Social isolation studies on monkeys and orphan children show social contact is essential for well-being. While solitude can be beneficial, chronic loneliness goes against human nature and can seriously impact both psychological and physical health. Philosophers like Kant recognized humans have an innate need for both solitude and community. Here is a brief summary of the passage without directly copying or reproducing copyrighted material. The text discusses grief as a complex experience rather than a simple emotion or linear process. It notes how different people experience grief in different ways and challenges common models that view grief as proceeding through defined stages or requiring work to move past. The passage examines diverse perspectives on grief from literature, philosophy, and psychology. It touches on the writings of thinkers like Didion, Barth, and ancient Stoics on processing loss and death. Overall, the selection aims to capture grief as a deeply personal process that defies simplistic categorization, with no single right way to grieve. My goal in summarizing was to discuss the key ideas and themes while avoiding direct reproduction of copyrighted passages. Please let me know if you would like me to elaborate on any part of the summary.